have a better video if you're up low. And step forward so that people can hear us, because not everybody's loud. Okay. You can stand next to her if you want, or wherever you're most comfortable. Good job. Sorry to interrupt you, Jack.
Okay, excellent.
Sorry to interrupt your conversation. Where are you going? Tell me where to go. Good morning, everyone. I am first going to, Okay. I'm first going to introduce Leonora Dodge, who is running for state rep in Chittenden-23. I got that right. And I'm really excited to be working with her as a partner on housing and in general on how we move forward as a state with some of the most critical crises that face us. So I'm really excited to introduce Leonora.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and really excited about Brenda's run. 22 years ago, I worked at Home Share Vermont, which is an organization that, for those of you who may not know, nonprofit that tries to solve two of Vermont's crucial issues, which are caregiving for seniors and people with disabilities that want to remain in their home, and young people seeking affordable housing. And it's 20 years later, and those issues have been, really not resolved. They've been exacerbated. In my race for a House seat, I have gotten to know Brenda, and I've gotten to know countless other legislators who have been working in our state to try to resolve these complicated problems. And what I've learned is that Brenda will be the collaborator that they've all been trying to work with. She is capable, she's informed, she is motivated, and she's deeply committed. As a Latina myself, who arrived here, 22 years ago and has raised my family here, and I've gotten to know so many people in the Latino community, new Vermonters have this challenge like none other, the challenge of finding housing. So I am very committed to supporting Brenda, and I am grateful that we have this prospect of working together to solve this issue. Thank you so much.
Now I'd love to call up my friend, current legislator running for state senate in Chittenden Central, Tanya Vyhovsky. I finally said it right. And close to right, and who has been an absolute champion on the housing issues that we face, and I'm really looking forward to working in partnership with her and with the Senate to really move forward with a plan.
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you for being here. I'd love to say that I'm excited to be here, but I wish I didn't have to be here. I started my nonprofit work at Pathways Vermont, working with Vermonters experiencing homelessness, and I have seen firsthand how critical it is for people's mental health, physical health, and overall well-being to have stable and affordable housing. And we know that we have had a crisis in housing in Vermont for a long time, and it has only gotten worse. And at this moment, we are listening to our governor say he wants to end programs that are putting roofs over people's heads. As it gets colder, as we start to worry about people potentially freezing to death in our state because they simply do not have a place to live. This problem has spread beyond what I saw when I worked at Pathways Vermont. It spread to everyone. We have people who cannot move here because they can't afford to live here, people who cannot stay here because they can't afford to live here, and people who are sleeping on the streets because they cannot afford to live here. And it is not okay. It is barbaric to be ending programs that make sure that people are stably and safely housed. We should be expanding programs. We should be looking at ways to ensure that we are creating safe rentals for people to live in. Renters often don't have a choice where else they are going to go, and landlords do have a choice as to whether or not they are going to create safe and stable housing. We are looking at a state where people like me, who grew up here, struggle to afford to live here, and have watched a dream of owning a home in my home state fade away. It's just never going to happen for me, and that's not okay. We need to expand affordable home ownership opportunities. That is not only important for people like me, but it's important for our state's economic growth. In the United States, people hold the vast majority of their wealth in their property. And when we only talk about affordable housing as rental properties, we are dooming people to cyclical poverty. We have to do better. And I know that Brenda will do better. I have stood on these steps with her before while she slept for almost a month demanding that we keep roofs over people's heads. I know Brenda is a fighter, and I know Brenda knows what it's like to struggle in Vermont. So many of the people that I see making policy and the people I saw making policy when I was young didn't have the life experience that I had and weren't fighting for working families like mine, but I know that Brenda will be different. Brenda has had the experience of not knowing if Vermont was going to work for her, like so many Vermonters have. In a time when more than 50% of Vermonters are facing housing insecurity or food insecurity, we need someone who gets it, not intellectually, but actually, and who is going to fight to make sure that Vermont is a place that is affordable, just, and sustainable for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, and both of you are tough acts to follow. Thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to working with these folks and legislators that I've been working with and community partners who I work with all the time on exactly these issues. I just realized I was looking at the wrong thing. Today is just 4 days from when the last person was able to apply for Vermont emergency rental assistance, and from when anyone newly experiencing homelessness could be included in the emergency transitional housing program. On October 1st, over 3,000 households lost their VRAP, or emergency rental assistance voucher. By December 1st, that will be up to 8,411 households, depending on how the state uses the potential, maybe, we may have found, an additional $20 million, and families will not know who will be saved from the housing roulette until almost 30 days notice. Families simply cannot plan with that notice. On October, whether you are experiencing homelessness or are upper middle income and everything in between, there's almost nowhere to live in our state. No mobility to move about the state, and nowhere to move from or to a starter home, and there is no solid plan that will ensure that we clear this crisis and meet the housing needs, not only of all who live here, but of all who we need to be able to find a place to live when they accept jobs in our state. That is not good for our communities, for our workforce, or for individuals. And none of the crises we face can be solved if we do not adequately address housing for both the short and long term. What is absent from this ongoing housing shortage is a clear plan on emergency, transitional, and permanent housing for everyone. We will have a housing task force in the Siegel administration that includes stakeholders and includes people with lived experience as well. That's the only way for us to address this housing crisis head on. We have to have a short-term and long-term strategic plan that each addresses emergency, transitional, and permanent housing. In the short term, we need a full assessment of how many households are lacking proper housing. How many are currently being housed in hotels and motels? How many are housed and need to be able to sell or purchase housing? And how many jobs cannot be filled because there's not adequate housing in each and every area across our state? We also need a full count of the housing stock and what will come online in what areas and in what time frame. We need to take immediate action to replicate the pods, utilize empty dormitories, consider pallet housing, and look into solutions that like expandable transitioned housing made from shipping containers that are happening right here in Springfield, Vermont. We must assess in each area what can be transitioned to transitional and permanent housing, what housing stock And absent immediate new regulations, we need to work with those who own short-term rentals to convert them into long-term housing. We then need to work with stakeholders in each area to develop a functional transition to a model that keeps people housed until we have enough permanent housing online to support transition to permanent housing and allows people to move to our state and fill these jobs that need to be filled. There are systemic changes that need to happen to make this happen. We need to change the rules for DA, motel, and emergency shelter because they are archaic rules that were developed in 1989. 1989. It is 2022. It is time for those rules to change. We need to direct the Human Rights Commission and to include unhoused people and with mental illness and substance use disorder and unhoused people in general. This includes legislative directive and appropriation. We must create housing for people who do not have landlord references within orgs that accept state funding. Tie that funding to a certain number of people who move from homelessness into long-term housing. And we need to create housing available to folks with criminal records. Communities are safer if people are contained and housed. We also need a Bill of Rights. We need to create this Housing Bill of Rights on the Housing First model and not any longer use the loss of housing as a way to punish people. This should be combined with a homelessness Bill of Rights overall. This short-term plan must include a plan for folks who are difficult to house, which includes people experiencing chronic homelessness, people with severe mental illness, people with substance use disorder, and what might shock folks is families with children and pregnant women. We also need a long-term strategic plan. We don't just need to make an investment that sounds impressive in housing. We need to make the right investment in the right places to ensure that we get to a place where people are not stuck or can't move here or at worst are unhoused. So our long-term strategic plan will work to create housing for all and again will include emergency, transitional, and permanent housing. But I want to note that emergency housing in a long-term strategic plan, once we get past this moment, should be a short blip in someone's life. We should be able to transition them. We should have the housing available for people to make the transition to permanent place to live or a long-term place to live. Emergency housing when someone experiences homelessness should be an incredible short period of time, as I said. If we have the appropriate supports in place, housing stocks available, and a plan, it will be an incredibly short period of time. We have to make sure that we have up-to-date data on successful models of emergency and transitional housing and require that folks in these settings are treated with dignity and have agency over their own lives. This means supporting shelters to move away from congregate shelters where it makes sense and supporting families or partners that need to be sheltered together so that folks do not lose their community. We also must support shelters in moving to a 24-hour model. There are still places in the state where that's not what's happening. It's only at night. And this can be done in the short and long term. We have to have in place a movable pallet house program so that the event of a natural disaster or other immediate needs, we have a plan in place that keeps people sheltered with dignity so that they are not further traumatized in the process. We have to increase funding for human service supports. If these are not fully funded, then we have failed at the structural change needed to make the experience of emergency housing a temporary part of someone's life, and failed to provide them and other providers with the supports they need to not create trauma to the individuals and burn out our workforce. Because right now we are burning out our workforce. The model has to include low barrier, no barrier, and other models, and we must codify into law the GA option. while removing dehumanizing rules that are present in our current emergency housing system. People experiencing homelessness are currently subject to rules that are predicated on the assumption that they did something wrong to end up there, and are not capable of making their own decisions about what would be best to support them to return to stability. We need to do away with that model, as it does not support humanizing supports or healthy and safe communities. To have an effective, comprehensive, long-term strategic plan, we must first make sure we know what the need is, as I stated before. We have to have that strong assessment, and then we have to work to meet the need in each area. Our solutions must include new builds, rehabilitations, zoning changes, and support these, and yes, regulations on short-term rentals. Now, I'm not talking about people who want to rent a home in their house or even an in-law apartment, but we can live in a state where we cannot live in a state where people can just buy up housing stock, convert it to short-term rentals, and people who live here are forced into their cars and tents, or to leave here altogether, to leave Vermont altogether. In fact, I thought we were trying really hard to keep people here and bring people here. It doesn't help our demographics if we don't do this. It doesn't help our workforce if we don't do this, and it doesn't help Vermonters or our communities. We indeed need to use models of home ownership that include condo-style and cooperative housing. There needs to be support for low and moderate income home ownership, and we need to have houses that constitute starter homes in our state, because we saw people be completely priced out who want starter homes right now. Right now, there's almost no such thing as a starter home, at least not for people who are just starting out. And there's folks who would like to transition to elder care facilities or to long-term care facilities and can't because the waiting lists are so long, and they would be giving up about, for example, 300 homes in Burlington that they would be selling and that would constitute as starter homes. That's what we lose out on when we don't address this crisis with a real plan. We again have to make sure we're building for need and figure out what triggers will let us know when we are again headed toward this crisis, so that we catch it in advance of this moment. And about short-term rentals. It's both out-of-state and in-state investors buying up these rentals, and it's multiple properties often, and our communities, especially sometimes in our rural communities or mountain communities, are seeing their housing stock disappear to short-term rentals when we have a housing crisis. We know that trickle-down doesn't work, and we need to be proactive and comprehensive in our plan. If people are going to do this, we should at least be able to have the regulation and revenue that can help us address the crisis in the future. We can't move forward without this actual plan. This isn't just about low-income housing or rentals. This isn't just about homelessness or rental assistance. This is every community at almost every income level across the state. This is the majority of our families and households. This is rental homes and home ownership. Allowing this crisis to loom is extremely expensive for our state. The fact is that the budget is how we keep our communities safe and whole. Being fiscally responsible includes solving the problems that exist in our communities and our state. I'll be working with our legislature to go over every dollar and make sure that the housing is addressed. We have been running out of federal dollars, and unfortunately, there's been some mismanagement of those dollars, as we saw with VRAP and ERAP. Those dollars could have been used in a different way to address this crisis that we're in now. However, my administration will work within our means to ensure that we have a solid path forward for every community for the housing crisis. When we don't have that strategic plan, we end up right where we are now. You can throw all the money in the world at the problem. If it is not done in a careful way that assesses how we address the current and anticipated long-term need for housing stock, that makes a plan on how we fill that need in each community, then we aren't solving that crisis. There's almost no housing in our state, even with what has come online. And by the way, those were projects that were started 3 to 5 years ago or 10 years ago, not what's happening right now. Those houses are filled right away, immediately, as soon as they come online, with still hundreds or thousands on waiting lists. It's important to remember that the only way out of this crisis is a strategic plan. I'm proud to present that to you today. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and I'm ready to dive right in. This is not a wait-and-see moment. We have to find a path forward, and I'm proud to have begun this work through my work with the legislature and to be able to, with your vote, carry it forward as governor. I have a comprehensive plan. I didn't want to talk to all the details with all of you, but I can pass it on to you so that you can have it. And I'm happy to take any questions, and so are both.
Brenda, one of the things that the governor talks about a lot, in fact he's talking about it this afternoon, is a sort of a workforce development issue. You know, we need housing, no one disagrees with that, but we first need construction workers to build that housing. How do you envision attracting workers, training through maybe tech centers, things like that? Where are the workers going to come from to build the houses?
So how do we bring workers without that place for them to live? It's a backwards idea to say the workers have to come first. We cannot bring workers to our state. People who maybe have those skills and are unhoused now or are struggling with rental assistance are panicking that in 3 months they aren't going to have a place to live, or now in 2 months they aren't going to have a place to live. Those folks need to be housed in order for us to actually address the crisis. So what I would say is that housing comes first. It comes first for lots of our health issues, and it comes first for our workforce. And so we need a transitional short-term plan in order to bring workers into those jobs that we need to maybe build our long-term plan. We need to have a short-term plan so that folks are housed when they get here. I don't understand what conceptually, how it could ever make sense to say we need the workers before we have the place for them to live. We need the place for them to live before we have the workers. I think it's really clear. We need both and, not either or, but you have to have somewhere for people to live. Are we asking them to sleep in a tent through the winter while they do the work?
How many of these proposals do you think that you can do unilaterally through executive action, and how many of these proposals would have to wait until January with buy-in from the legislature?
Well, I would not start until January. So I would have the opportunity to have that buy-in from the legislature. I think there is lots that he could have done, however, coming to the legislature with the money that was had both last legislative session and right now to make sure that they have a temporary plan in place. Legislators are all for making sure people don't end up on the street, and so they would have been open to proposals that would have ensured that their constituents were not going to end up sleeping in tents or on the sidewalk this winter.
Developers that I speak with, they say Act 250, but more so local zoning regulations is one of the bigger challenges to building out, especially that missing middle housing that we talk so much about. The governor has said that there's reform that's needed in the permitting arena. What do you think should happen?
So there is a geographic equity issue in the way that we address zoning, and sometimes that can stop the new builds of houses, including where we might think of cooperative housing or condo-style housing, which I want to just also mention does often create a bias towards communities of color and low-income families who would be better able to afford that housing. And so it's something that I think is really ingrained in us, that type of bias. But some of these zoning changes we can make without taking away all the local control, which Vermonters really love. There is a way to have some zoning changes in the state that address things like being able to have multi-unit houses in regular neighborhoods, that address things like being able to build on top of a one-story shop, several apartments in the second story. Without, we are able to maintain Vermont without, while still creating more housing, and especially as we centralize it more locally, that's really good for our climate needs as well. And so, and for folks, both younger folks, low-income folks, and our aging population, who all often get isolated at home. So these are changes that we have to make, and Act 250 does need to be updated. But it also needs to be fully staffed. The office needs to be fully staffed. It is not fully staffed on purpose right now, and that slows down the approval of permits by a lot, which keeps us from being able to build that housing stock a little faster. So it needs to be fully staffed. I don't know if Tanya also has. Go ahead.
Certainly all of our policies need to be updated, but they need to be updated in a manner that protects our environment and protects the people buying homes and renting homes. I think one of the things that we really need to look at as we think about our climate needs and the needs of Vermonters is building in already existing city centers with infill building, or as Brenda said, moving upwards, so that we can preserve our Vermont forests and preserve our environment. This creates more walkable downtowns. It creates an ability to invest in public transit and make it easier for people to get to and from their jobs, as well as protecting the environment. Again, adequate staffing is certainly important, and working with our towns to build out inclusionary zoning and really thinking about what we want our towns to be and how we create diverse and multi-income communities. We know that that is what is best for communities and what is best for Vermonters.
Brenda, could you tell me a little bit more about your views on the short-term rental issue? Are you contemplating changes or regulations on current owners of short-term rentals, or limits on future conversions?
I think current and future for people who are purchasing whole properties. Again, there's no problem. There's lots of reasons why people have to use a room in their house or an in-law apartment or even an ADU sometimes as a short-term rental in order for them to be able to stay in their home often. That's often what you see in those situations. But there are investors who buy up entire properties or sometimes multiple properties and use all of them for short-term rentals. And we should be getting enough revenue from that to help address our housing crisis at minimum. And there should be regulations about how that is done. There's regulations for our hotel industry, and frankly, if you're buying up whole investment properties for this purpose, you are using it in a way that the same way that a hotel industry is using it.
I just had a question about the price tag on some of these. Certainly the task force you mentioned is going to put together some of these proposals and take a look at what is the need, and we're going to gather the data first, then make a pitch to lawmakers. How do you propose funding some of the, we've had a huge influx of federal cash the past few years. How do you plan on funding some of these initiatives going forward?
So one of the things that we have to do is we have to make sure that we assess how much it's costing us not to solve the problem, because I would argue that it's quite expensive for us to have this housing crisis. Look at how much we're spending right now on hotels, right? We're spending over $5,000 a month per household on the hotels because we don't have a plan. How much money did that cost us over the last several years that could have been used for us to actually create a long-term strategic plan for housing? Now, these folks needed to be sheltered. This was the right thing to do. That said, if we had solved this crisis ahead of time or hadn't let it barrel out of control the way it had pre-pandemic, we were already in this crisis pre-pandemic, then we would have actually saved quite a lot of money. Also, we're going to get revenue from regulating some of these short-term rentals, just like we do from the hotel industry. We're going to make sure that that revenue is utilized for housing, and that's going to bring some in. And then additionally, we have to look at the budget again overall, because how we solve the crises is part of the budget. The budget is about fiscal responsibility, is about making sure that our state is not spending more money long-term by not making the investment in the short term.